What is a dictator? It's an interesting question. I should probably have written a book called How to Spot a Dictator. There seems to be a great amount of confusion. I slurp my noodles at home. My wife won't allow me to do it. She's a dictator. My boss is a dictator. The leader of my democratically elected country is a dictator. Everyone I don't like is a dictator, so the term has acquired all sorts of new dimensions. But ultimately, it's about power. You can do two things with it. You can see that throughout the 20th century. You can either separate it. With separation of powers, you build up checks and balances, an independent judicial system, etc., etc. A great historical achievement, and it's very difficult to do. I mean, how do you get a leader to respect the court order? Not easy. On the other hand, throughout the 20th century, of those who wish to concentrate power, they spurn all that wishy-washy separation of powers. So these are two radically opposed users of power, and hence two radically opposed regimes. Now, it's true that since the late 1980s, we've seen developments in which a leader operates within a system of separation of powers, but undermines it. I haven't written about this in the book, but I call this de-democratization.
The narcissistic or psychopathic leader is the culmination and reification of his period, culture, and civilization. He is likely to rise to prominence in sick, narcissistic, and psychopathic societies. The leader's mental health pathologies resonate with the anomalies of his society and culture. And I call it the psychopathological resonance between leadership and people.
How to be a dictator is really a narrative history. There's no abstraction, no general theory, no generalizing there. It's really about unique individuals and unique circumstances. So there's a lot of storytelling going on. I would say 8 suitably chilling tales in that book. In fact, if anything comes out of the book, is that these unique individuals in unique circumstances, they go from Mussolini to Hitler, Stalin, Mao, 4 big ones, Kim Il-sung, also big, I imagine, Duvalier or Papa Doc in Haiti, to Ceausescu in Romania, and finally Mengistu in Ethiopia. They're all quite unique individuals. Not only that, but they've got great talents. So ability matters a great deal, and luck. And it's that combination which is so important. In particular, the ability to use both fortune and misfortune, which is why it cannot possibly be a guide on how to be a dictator. Nonetheless, overall, there are 2 main instruments that appear to me to be very important out of these 8 tales. One is terror, and seemingly contradictory, there is worship, or what I call the cult personality.
Yes.
Fear and love. We know a great deal about the terror. We know a great deal about the prisons, the camps, the knock on the door in the middle of the night, the extraordinary crimes against humanity, but we know less about the cult of personality, which is the subtitle of the book, and turns out, I think, to be quite important. We know little about it, despite the fact that hundreds of millions of people throughout the 20th century cheered their own dictators, even as they were herded down the road towards serfdom. The portrait of a dictator in many parts of the country was everywhere to be seen, displayed in every factory, every school, every office. People had to bow to his likeness, pass by his statue, praise his name, extol his genius. I think at the heart of that cult of personality, there is a paradox which is specific to every dictator. The paradox of the modern dictator is that he must create the illusion of popular support. since the French Revolution, 1789, but in particular in the 20th century, people are supposed to be sovereign and select their leader through an election. The 20th century is the age of democracy. But dictators, of course, opted to seize power, either by organizing a coup or by rigging the system. And as they found out, when you obtain power through violence, you must maintain it with even more violence. But violence can be a very blunt instrument. You do need terror. You do need the police, spies, interrogators. But ultimately, if you can coerce your population to acclaim you in public, if you can create the illusion of popular support, you will last a lot longer. In other words, it is good to police every street. It is probably better if you can police every mind. Your goal really ought to be that people wake up in the middle of the night afraid of their own thoughts. That's the goal, I think. So fear must be instilled in the population at large, but also the inner court, the entourage of the dictator. After all, a dictator is someone who seizes power. And by seizing power, he raises the prospect of someone else doing precisely the same thing, the stab in the back. Dictators are surrounded by allies and rivals, all waiting in the wings. There are many ways in which dictators deal, of course, with rivals. There's endless purges. There's manipulation, there's divide and rule. But ultimately, again, the cult of personality works rather well. It forces allies and rivals to collaborate in common subordination. Most of all, it compels them to stand up and acclaim the dictator in front of all the others. It turns everyone into a liar. When everybody lies, it becomes very difficult to find out who thinks what. And when you don't know who thinks what, it becomes difficult to find associates, accomplices, when you wish to overthrow the man and seize power in turn. Who organized the cult? Well, there were, of course, writers, poets, playwrights, powerful ministries of propaganda, sometimes entire sections of industry devoted to churning out cult objects. But ultimately, the responsibility was always with the dictator himself. Mussolini, by one account, spent half of his time projecting himself as the all-powerful leader of Italy. He would spend time in Villa Torlonia, a sprawling estate he acquired in 1925, sitting in his projection room, studying his every gesture during his public performances. Everything was calculated to project an image of vitality and power. He also showed himself to millions in whirlwind tours of the country, endless mass meetings with workers, inauguration of public projects. Hitler also devoted an extraordinary amount of time to building up his own image. He was a gifted orator, a talented self-publicist, a choreographer who worked tirelessly at building up his own party. He hired a photographer, again, to produce images that projected strength and sheer willpower. 1933, as he discovered the radio, he worked hard to make sure his voice could be heard everywhere. When Joseph Goebbels failed to make enough of cinema, Hitler turned around, approached Leni Riefenstahl, who made sure he was the star in a great number of movies shown in every theater. Nonetheless, frequently, the expressions of devotion from ordinary people seemed to be so spontaneous that outsiders, and later on historians, thought that they were actually genuine. Millions of people, we have been told, adored Adolf Hitler, adored Stalin, adored Mao. But how would we know? The very first casualty in any dictatorship is always freedom of expression. Within a year after the Nazis came to power in 1933, 100,000 ordinary Germans were locked up in concentration camps. The Gestapo, the brown shirts, the courts did not hesitate to lock up anyone who expressed an opinion that was critical of the regime. By 1938, it was enough for a person to express a negative opinion of the Führer to be locked up in a prison. Of course, you could say that on his birthday, on the 20th of April, 1939, the Führer reigned like an emperor sitting on a raised dais on the Via Triumphalis built by Albert Speer to review that mighty war machine he had been building up for years, as he was acclaimed literally by tens of thousands of assembled Germans. But who knows that exactly a year later, in 1940, there were a mere 75 well-wishers gathered outside the Chancellery on Adolf Hitler's birthday. Well, Adolf Hitler fancied himself as Europe's finest actor. Mussolini, too, thought he was a great performer. We tend to forget that ordinary people in dictatorships also must learn how to act. They must cheer on command. They must parrot the party line. They must recite the work of the leader. And those who fail to play along are fined, interrogated, locked up, occasionally shot. In other words, ordinary people here are coerced to produce the illusion of popular support. They are condemned to perpetual enthusiasm. I'm not trying to say that nobody loved their own dictator. But the whole point of the cult of personality was not to convince or persuade anyone. The cult of personality was there to destroy common sense, to enforce obedience, to isolate individuals and crush their dignity. Now, here's my point 3. I will have 4 in total. Sometimes the cult, even in Marxist-Leninist regimes, appeared to be tinted with superstition and magic. It had traditional undertones, as if it somehow welled from the hearts of the people. This too was deliberately fabricated from above. In the case of Adolf Hitler, it was crystal clear. He saw himself as a messiah in an almost religious bond with his people. Mussolini encouraged feelings of devotion, which were characteristic of the Christian church, with holy pictures, holy sites, pilgrimages, the hope of a holy healing touch from the leader in Rome. Duvalier in Haiti encouraged rumors about his otherworldly powers. Yeah. He very much projected him as someone who was in touch with the other world, like a voodoo priest. He modeled himself on Baron Samedi, the spirit of the dead, guardian of cemeteries, by appearing occasionally in public with a tall hat and tailcoat. He would mumble behind dark glasses in a deep nasal tone, as if somehow casting incantations on his enemies. In the case of Mengistu, he rapidly, after the revolution in 1974, occupied the Grand Palace, had Haile Selassie, the emperor, throttled to death, buried him underneath his very own office, placed his desk right above it in order to somehow, profit from that charisma coming from the body of his predecessor. Here was a self-proclaimed Marxist who reigned like an emperor. In the case, of course, of Marxist-Leninist regimes, there was a reason why these religious overtones were quite deliberately cultivated. And the reason is quite simple, really. In overwhelmingly rural countries like Russia, China, Korea, Ethiopia, the very vast majority of the population had very little interest in the tenets of Marxism, Leninism. They, like me, failed to understand the appeal of dialectical materialism. Stalin understood this perfectly well, and others in his wake. When the Soviets decided to embalm their leader Lenin and display him on Red Square, they very much hoped that the population would worship him very much like a holy figure. My final point, point 4, in case you lost track, is that loyalty to a person matters more than loyalty to a creed. When I went to university, it was all about the importance of ideology. While ideologies can be very decisive, the greatest enemies of the Bolsheviks were the Mensheviks. Ultimately, what a dictator wants is absolute loyalty. It would have been dangerous to study Marx during the Cultural Revolution. One was a Stalinist under Stalin, a Maoist under Mao, a Kimist under Kim. Not only that, but frequently these self-proclaimed Marxist-Leninists turn Marx on their head.
He is likely to rise to prominence in sick, narcissistic, and psychopathic societies. The leader's mental health pathologies resonate with the anomalies of his society and culture. And I call it the psychopathological resonance between leadership and people. The leader and the led form a kind of self-enhancing and self-reinforcing feedback loop, a dyad of mirrored admiration, of reflected love. By elevating and idealizing their Führer, their leader, the mob actually elevates and idealizes itself. In his ascendance, his followers find hope. In his manifest illness, they find curative solace and a legitimation of their own collective insanity. The malignant narcissist invents and then projects a false, fictitious self for the world to fear or to admire. He maintains a tenuous grasp on reality to start with. And this lack of reality test is further exacerbated by the trappings of power in the case of the narcissistic leader. The narcissist's grandiose self-delusions and fantasies of omnipotence and omniscience are supported when the narcissist attains real-life authority. And the narcissist's predilection to surround himself with obsequious sycophants, with yes-men, only makes matters worse. The narcissist's personality is so precariously balanced that he cannot tolerate even a hint of criticism or disagreement. Most narcissists are also paranoid, and they suffer from ideas of reference. In other words, they believe that they are being mocked or discussed even when they are not. Thus, narcissists often regard themselves as victims of persecution, a martyr for the cause. The narcissistic leader fosters and encourages a personality cult with all the hallmarks of an institutional religion. So there is a priesthood, rites, rituals, temples, worship, catechism, and a personal mythology of the leader. The leader is this religion's saint. He monastically denies himself earthly pleasures, or at least so he claims, in order to be able to dedicate himself fully to his calling and to his people. Many narcissistic and psychopathic leaders become hostages to their self-imposed rigid ideologies. They fancy themselves Platonic philosopher kings. Since they lack empathy, they regard their subjects as a manufacturer would regard raw material. As far as they're concerned, their followers and even the nation, these are collateral damage in a vast historical process. You can hear narcissistic or psychopathic leaders often say, when one makes an omelette, one has to break eggs. Or when one chips at wood, splinters fly, and so on. Narcissistic leadership is not about life or substance. It's about theater. To enjoy the spectacle and be subsumed by it, the cultish leader demands the suspension of judgment and the attainment of depersonalization and derealization. Catharsis in this political process is tantamount in this narcissistic dramaturgy to self-annulment. Narcissistic leadership often poses as a rebellion against something, against the old ways, against the hegemonic culture, against the upper classes, against the established religions, against the superpowers, against the corrupt order. It always defines himself by opposition. Narcissistic movements are puerile, adolescent. They are a reaction to narcissistic injuries if inflicted upon a narcissistic group or collective. In this vortex of hatred and exclusion, minorities or others, often arbitrarily selected, constitute a perfect, easily identifiable embodiment of all that is wrong and evil. They're kind of a foil. They are the perfect hate figure. Narcissistic leaders thrive on hatred and pathological envy, and channel it and direct it. The narcissistic leader prefers the sparkle and glamour of well-orchestrated illusions to the tedium and method of real accomplishments. The narcissistic leader's reign is all smoke and mirrors, devoid of substance, consisting of mere appearances and mass delusions. And in the aftermath of his regime, the narcissistic leader, having died or been deposed or voted out of office, which is rare, it all unravels. The tireless and constant prestidigitation ceases, and the entire edifice built by the narcissist crumbles. What looked like an economic miracle turns out to have been a fraud-laced bubble. Loosely held empires disintegrate. Laboriously assembled business conglomerates go to pieces. Earth-shattering and revolutionary scientific discoveries and theories are discredited. Social experiments end in mayhem. As their end draws near, narcissistic psychopathic leaders act out, lash out, erupt. They attack with equal ferocity and virulence compatriots, erstwhile allies, neighbors, and foreigners.